All right, y'all. It says that we are live. If we are live, if I'm coming through and you can hear and see me, will somebody give me a yes or a thumbs up? Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Price. Very good, Jeffrey K. All right, guys. Thank you. Um, First off, I just want to say I am really glad to be here with y'all tonight. I wanted to say that just because I had that wave kind of come over me just now, sitting here getting ready to start, and just seeing y'all's names on the screen and just how familiar a lot of them have become to me over time, and it just gave me this wave of gratitude uh, that I get to do this and that you guys have been with me. Some of you have been with me for years now, and I appreciate that very much. And it feels really great doing this. So before I launch into what we're going to be talking tonight, Cypher says, long time lurker, first time active chatter. Well, I am glad you are chatting. Before we get started tonight, talking about the 3 stages of alchemy, and it's probably not going to be what you are thinking it's going to be. You know, what I mean by that is a lot of times people get really off into the weeds with this stuff. There are different levels and layers of understanding to this sort of thing, like when you're talking about the practice of alchemy. And on one level, it's not very, very complicated, very difficult at all. It is very easy to understand on one level. On another level, it can be complicated. It can be difficult. It can be like really getting into the weeds. You know, think about magic, for example. Like on one level, I could say magic is really not complicated at all. You know, it's like that saying, they say if you can't describe something, I can't remember who said this exactly, may have been Einstein, I don't even know why I'm thinking that, may have been somebody else entirely. But somebody was saying if you can't articulate something in convey it in like a really simple, understandable way, it's because you yourself don't understand it. And I think to a certain extent, at least that is at least partially true when it comes to magic, when it comes to alchemy. When I was a kid, my dad used to have a saying. He would say, if you can't dazzle them with brilliance, baffle them with bullshit. And I think you find that a lot in magic. People making things pointlessly complicated for various reasons, one of which may be sometimes that they don't really fully understand it themselves. Maybe they've read a bunch of books, but they've never went through the process, whatever. But think about it this way. You know, on one level, I could say magic is really simple. That all you have to do magic is visualize something, add some breath work in there, and that's your heavy lifting. You know, you might do some other things like some rituals, breath work, visualization. Makes it sound really simple, right? But then I could also say, I could start like, y'all would understand this, but the average person on the street would not. If I started saying, well, first you've got your lesser pentagram rituals, your lesser banishing and your lesser invoking, and it deals with the elements. So the first level of the work is the elemental work, and you're going to separate it and go through each of the elements one at a time: earth, air, fire, water. Even by that point, most people would be like, what does that mean? What do you mean go through the elements one at a time? How do I go through the elements one at a time? Y'all been on here long enough, been with me long enough that you know that means you would be invoking and banishing. Like you would be using the lesser pentagram ritual to be invoking the energies of earth or air or fire or water. And I could go on and say, and then from the lesser pentagram rituals, you're going to go into the greater hexagram rituals. And with the greater hexagram rituals, you're going to be invoking planetary energies. And yeah, that makes sense to us because we talk about this stuff all the time. It's something that most of us are interested in. But the average person on the street is going to be like, what? What are you talking? How do you work with a planetary energy? Now, I had a guy ask me one time, we were in a magic shop. This is a guy who was really interested in this stuff, not interested enough to actually do the work. He was more of like he kind of wanted to use it to create like this mysterious identity for himself. but he didn't actually, and I'm not saying that in a bad way. He was a kind of entertainer of a sort. Um, like did a lot of work in like really avant-garde art realms, and he wanted to use this stuff to create like this mystique around himself, but he didn't really understand it on a deep level. So we go into a magic shop together one day, and yeah, that's it. Brooke Hughes says using magic for the aesthetic. That's what I'm trying to say. That's what he was into. And most people would probably think this guy knew something about magic, based on the work that he put out and stuff like that. But we go into a magic shop one day, and we're looking like in this shop, they have this table set out, and there's tons of every kind of stone and crystal and rock and everything you can imagine laid out on this table. And he looks at me and he asks me, he goes, okay, I understand all this stuff is connected to like magic in some way. Like people say that this stone is good for this, like say, for example, rose quartz is good for love. He was like, but what do you do with this stuff? How do you use this stuff? And I was just kind of joking with him. I said, well, what I usually do is I keep a pocket full of them when I'm doing a class. And then when somebody asks me a stupid ass question, I take one out and hit them with the rock. And he was like, oh, magic hurts. I don't want that. But my point is, yes, this stuff can seem complicated if you don't have any kind of practical experience with it. You can read a bunch of books that tell you this rock is for this, and this rock is for that, and this rock is for this. But that doesn't mean, and a lot of people just sit around and memorize this stuff, but it doesn't mean that you know how to actually use it. Like if I gave you a piece of rose quartz and said, okay, use this piece of rose quartz to invoke more love into your life in some way, whether it's self-love or a loving relationship or whatever it is, how would you do that? Whole different thing. So what I wanted to talk about, and my point is, it's the same way with alchemy. Yes, you can get really into the like the weeds with some of this stuff, but I wanted to talk for 1 second about something someone asked a while ago. Hold on, let me see who it was, because it was something that was really pertinent. Oh, Nick. Nick says, when I think about alchemy, I think about traditional alchemy, lab and setup. Also, how alchemy or some alchemists seem to come down on the tree of life. I'm guessing, assuming when you say come down on the tree of life, you mean like look down on it, like disparage it, what have you. One of the things about that kind of stuff is you are going to find that it's kind of, in a way, a kind of cliquish, cultish mentality. Everybody, well, not everybody, but in all aspects of magic, you always come across these kind of cultish thinking people. What I mean by cultish is like, oh, our way is the real way. Our way is the true way. Everybody else is a charlatan. Everybody else is a fraud. You come across that all the time. And it's not just in magic. That's like human nature in a lot of ways. What that usually tells you, if the person is doing that, if the person is still stuck in that frame of mind, is that they haven't gotten very far into the work. But like you see the same thing. I'll give you a really blatant example. Like if you see anything about martial arts on the internet at all, like say on Instagram, they're like right now in the world, Brazilian jiu-jitsu is the thing. Like back in the 80s, what I mean by the thing, like back in the 80s, it was karate. Karate exploded because you had Chuck Norris like reaching his peak and putting out all of those movies, and you had all of those Karate Kid movies, and you just had tons of stuff about karate coming out in the 80s. So everything was all about karate. 70s, it was more about kung fu. Like all those great, somewhat cheesy, but still really great kung fu movies, most of them came out in the 70s. That was like the heyday of kung fu. Now you have that same thing happening with Brazilian jiu-jitsu, BJJ. And if you listen to people who practice Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu argue online, no other martial art is even remotely effective in any way except Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It can beat all martial arts. It's the greatest, it's the highest. Everything else is just outdated. And once again, it's just another version of that. Oh, we're the authentic thing. These other people are charlatans. These other people are frauds. So it's not just in the world of magic that you see this kind of stuff, or in the world of alchemy. It's like human nature, and you see it all over the place. Like when you really start getting into different cultures, you're going to find that. Like another example, one that I myself was involved in the world of, is the tattoo world. You find that same thing in the tattoo world. But my point is, what I wanted to address about this is, you said when you think of alchemy, you think about traditional alchemy lab and setup. And that can be part of it, absolutely. You know, like I've done videos years ago, like especially during the pandemic when we were locked down and I had a lot of time on my hands because nobody's going out, nobody's doing anything, the whole world was shut down. I started doing videos where I was showing like I did a whole video on just how to use an alchemical setup, you know, the distillation kit. I was putting lavender through the distillation kit and just describing each part of the mechanism and what's happening to it as it's evaporating and coming down, and showing like what you're collecting, all this kind of stuff, how to extract the essential oils from it, all that. So yes, that can be a part of it, but it's not the most important part, not by far. The most important part is what's going on in here. All of that lab equipment, unless you are just doing something like say make tinctures, like if making tinctures is your thing, then the lab equipment is absolutely the heart and soul of what you're doing. But when I'm talking about alchemy, I'm talking about the highest aspects of alchemy, which is ourself, putting ourself through the alchemical process, putting ourself through the completion of the great work. When that's what you're talking about, all of that equipment is just training wheels, exactly like all of the other crap in magic, the robes, the wands, the chalices, the rocks and stones, the incenses, just like all of that stuff is training wheels. The magic is here. The magic is in you. There's no magic in anything else outside of you. That stuff is just like training wheels that allows you to make connections with stuff going on in your internal world and kind of put it in motion deliberately. Like by doing certain things, you set certain things inside yourself in motion deliberately. Same way with the alchemical setup. The heart and soul of alchemy has nothing to do with, like, we're seeking immortality, spiritual immortality. The same thing like that they're doing in Tibetan Buddhism when they're talking about creating the rainbow body, like all of that stuff. We're talking about spiritual immortality. To me, like there's something when you get into Western alchemy, Western alchemical traditions, that is almost like, in a certain sense, in its infancy compared to Eastern alchemical traditions, like especially things like Taoism, like Qigong. Qigong comes from Eastern alchemy. The whole point of Qigong is to put yourself through the alchemical process. Qigong was part of Taoism. The Taoists were the first documented alchemists in the world, centuries before anything in the West would start, before anybody would ever start talking about alchemy over here. They were talking about it centuries before over there. And a lot of times, most of the time, it had nothing to do with a lab setup whatsoever. It was internal processes. If you want to go deeper into that, to be honest, I find it incredibly boring, certain parts of it, or certain parts of this guy's writing. I think he's probably like great for explaining this stuff, but it's not very fun to me, at least. There's a guy named Montauk Chia, who has written a ton of books on Eastern internal alchemy systems. But My point tonight, let me get back to y'all's comments real quick. But does that make sense, Nick? Yeah, Marilyn Gray says, I read a book about how that's where Western alchemy came from, east to west. Yes, almost. Nick says alchemist descends down the tree, or so the literature seems to suggest. That wouldn't really make any sense because that would mean that they had to start out at perfection and then come down to a less perfect state by doing alchemy. So no, they don't really descend the tree in that sense. Nick says BJJ is the AMORC. But what I wanted to talk about was the simpler, a much more simple aspect of alchemy, which is a little bit of the symbolism of the very first things that you are ever going to hear whenever you come to the study or the world of alchemy. And that is the 3 stages of alchemy: Nigredo, Albedo, and Rubedo. And these things sound super complicated in the beginning. Like, I mean, there's a ton of images that portray this stuff in symbolic form. I chose one series of 3 pictures to show you as just one example of the way this stuff is portrayed. So the very first step of the process is called Nigredo, and it means the blackening. That's literally what it means. And if you look up, like even on the internet, like what does this mean, Nigredo, the blackening? Like one thing that you come across is, well, that's another thing. Jimmy Joe says, don't forget citronitas. That's another thing. Whenever you like, some people don't, and this is going to be entirely up to your own thing, like whether you see stuff one way or the other. Some people say that there's 4 stages of alchemy, including a 4th one between Albedo and Rubedo called citronitas, the yellowing. Other people say that citronitas is not really a stage in and of itself, that it's more like the last parts of Albedo. Some people look at it one way, some people look at it another way. Does it matter ultimately? Not really. It's going to depend entirely on what you find most useful. But one of the pictures I wanted to show you is this. This is one of the ways, this is one of the symbols of the Nigredo phase of magic. And what does it mean by blackening? Well, another is putrefaction. And that's what you see across the top here. It's the Latin word for putrefaction, meaning something that is putrefying. It is rotting away. Well, what rots away? The dead. Stuff that is dead rots away. So we have the very first step of the alchemical process is what? Death. That's what the Nigredo, the blackening, the putrefaction stage, all of that. That's what that is. That's death. We'll come back to this. Second stage is Albedo, the whitening. This is the image that I chose to show you that represents this. That represents the Albedo stage. So you see the first one, we have the blackening. Second one, we have the whitening. Well, if this is death, if the blackening is death, the whitening would be what? Rebirth. And technically, like if you look this up, like what's happening during this stage is during the whitening, you are purifying yourself. How do you purify yourself? By consuming divine sustenance, by consuming energy. In the same way, remember what I said a while ago about how Taoism and Qigong was like some of the very earliest forms of alchemy in the world? Well, mostly what Qigong is, like when you see people doing Qigong, they'll be doing these series of really simple movements. You know, say for example, you'll see one where you see people, they turn to their left and they raise their right hand, and they come down and they put their right hand over their chest. And then they turn to the right, but they raise their left hand, and they come back down and they put their left hand over their chest. And you'll see them you're usually standing when you do this, and you'll rise up on your tiptoes, reaching this way, come down. Rise up on your tiptoes, reaching this way, come down. And you'll see people like going back and forth like that. And it's physical movement that is, you know, exercising your body, but what you're visualizing and what you're doing whenever you're carrying out these physical gestures, these physical motions, is remember in our the ritual we did for the spring equinox. Those of y'all in Magnum Opus, you remember how we did that ritual where at one point in it, you're supposed to be visualizing like the sun outside of you and visualizing your Tippereth center at the same time. And you reach up and you grab the sun and you pull it down and put it into your Tippereth center. This is the exact same thing you're doing in Qigong whenever you're doing this motion over and over and over. The only difference is you can do it either, you could do it with the sun, or you can also do it just with Qi, with energy. Like we are surrounded by this field of energy, like fish in an aquarium. And every time you reach up, you're grabbing some of it and pulling it into your Tippereth center. Grabbing some and pulling it into your Tippereth center. This is the whitening. Another way that the whitening looks is whenever you're doing all of these rituals, when you're doing the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, when you're doing the lesser invoking ritual of the pentagram, when you're doing all the hexagram rituals, one of the things that a lot of people don't understand in the beginning of doing this work is that like let's say, for example, you went through the greater invoking hexagram of soul and you invoked all the angels around you that correspond to that. And then you left the room. A lot of people that don't understand the mechanics of what's going on here, like they'll think that when they leave the room, that unless they banish first, or unless they tell the angels to go back where they came from, or whatever it is, that whenever they walk out of the room, that stuff is all still going to be in the room. The angels are still going to be there. The hexagrams are going to be around the walls, all this kind of stuff. It's not true. What happens when you invoke those things is your aura absorbs them. When you walk out of that room, you carry all of that energy out of that room with you. You have consumed it as divine sustenance. Just like whenever you're doing this Qigong, you're doing it in a much smaller way. Like you're taking a drop of energy, a drop of energy, a drop of energy. But if you're doing this invoking, like you're pouring like a massive amount of energy into yourself at one time. This is the example I always give about like what we're doing when we're doing magic. Like what does purification mean? How does that purify us? How does taking in this divine energy purify us? The metaphor that I always use, this is what I'm talking about whenever I say, if you take a glass of water and you leave it sitting in a room and just leave it sitting there for, let's say, a month, it's going to get funky. It's going to form a film on it. It's going to get cloudy. There's going to be crud floating in it. But if you take that glass of water to the kitchen and you turn the faucet on and you hold that glass of water under that running faucet and just start letting the water overflow and overflow and overflow, eventually what's going to happen is you're going to end up with a clean glass of water again. That's the purification stage. That's what you're doing, whether you're doing it in this Qigong way or whether you're doing it in a ceremonial magic way. You're taking in this energy. I'm going to come back to this in 1 second. Actually, let me finish this part now. Let me talk about this one part now. So why do we have death first? Why do we have the blackening first and then the whitening? Because what this is portraying is the initiation process. You have to die and then you're reborn. It's mirrored, so I'm showing you the backwards. First you die and then you're reborn. If you want to see how this plays out in different rituals, compare it to the ritual of baptism. Like in the Christian church, whenever you are baptized, or the Catholic Church, we have in the Catholic Church there are what's the word I'm trying to think of? It starts with a C. No, sacraments. Doesn't start with a C at all. Starts with an S. We have sacraments in the Catholic Church. The first sacrament that you receive as a baby is baptism. You will not receive. So that's represents death. Like just like in the baptism, even if you're not Catholic, say you're like in a Protestant church where they do it when you're an adult, you're still enacting the death process, which I think in a way makes more sense than doing it when you're a baby. I think it makes much more sense to do it when you're a full-grown adult, when you understand the mechanics and what you're actually doing. But baptism starts with death. They'll take you and lower you under the water. When they lower you under the water, that's you being buried in the ground. You're being put in the grave. When they raise you up out of the water, that's you being reborn into a new life, a new kind of life. Alchemy starts with death for the same reason that all these other initiatory traditions start with death. It's because the old you has to die before the new you is being reborn. In the Catholic Church, you do not take communion unless and until you have been baptized. It's different in, different Protestant churches, but in the Catholic Church, you do not receive communion if you have not been baptized. That's because receiving communion is the second step of the process. Like that's the entire point and purpose of going to a Catholic church. Like you go to a Protestant church to hear something, to hear a message, to me that can be even more important sometimes, or in certain stages of your life than the communion process. Like I've always talked about like Joel Osteen and how much I got out, how much life it breathed into me, like hearing this man talk. But technically in the Catholic Church, you're doing something entirely different. In the Catholic Church, the whole point of going to church is to partake of a ritual. And what this ritual is everyone in the church like feeding energy to the priest and the priest directing the energy into the communion wafers and the chalice of wine. That's what the whole communion ritual is about. It's him putting divine energy into this stuff. That way, whenever you step up there and you open your mouth and he puts that communion wafer on your tongue or hands you that chalice and you take a drink of that wine, you are consuming spiritual sustenance. If this is done correctly, like by someone who knows what they're doing, and most people don't, most people don't realize like they're supposed to be visualizing anything. They don't understand that there is divine energy all around us, all of this kind of stuff. They're just going through the motions of the ritual. Sometimes somebody told me one time, a guy that was in the Masons, he was talking about how, and this was a guy that was, pretty, really well versed in this stuff, but he was talking about how the average person in the Masons has no idea what any of this stuff means. They try to portray the stuff on the internet and in the media like the Masons are like this, elite group of people who are carrying out magic and know what they're doing and all this kind of stuff, and most of them are. To be honest, at least 95% of them are dudes who belong to this group because it gives them the opportunity to get together and hang out with a bunch of other dudes and drink and smoke cigars and talk shit once a month or whatever. Yeah, Gannica says most lodges just do fundraisers and community outreach. Exactly. But this guy that I was talking to, he said, like, I know that. I acknowledge that. But that doesn't mean that there isn't still something incredibly valuable here. That the Masonic order does possess something incredibly important. I'm trying to think of how to say what it is exactly. That it does knowledge and wisdom. That there is knowledge and wisdom there, but most of these people don't understand it. He said, but the way I view all of these other people is almost like the Masons do have a treasure. There is a treasure here. For those with eyes to see, there is a treasure here. And these other people, the ones that just belong to it for whatever reasons, are like the goblins that take care of that treasure for the people who do who do have eyes to see it, to find it. For the people who are going to actually understand and do the work, it's the job of all of these goblins and these party guys to preserve this information and make sure this lineage lives on so that true seekers can find it. Point is, theoretically, when you receive communion in the Catholic Church, you are doing the exact same thing you're doing when you are doing ritual magic. The only difference is when you're doing ritual work, you are your own priest. You are doing the job that the priest does when he's standing up there saying mass. This is why I look back at the self-initiation ritual that we talked about, that I gave y'all years ago at this point, where you do the lesser invoking ritual, the pentagram, and then you take your chalice of water around to each of the 4 archangels and you ask for their blessings, their favor to descend upon this chalice or this piece of bread, and then you eat it and see yourself infused with all that energy. That's the same thing people are supposed to be doing in a mass. But you're your own priest during ritual. During ritual, you're doing the same thing. You're bringing in all this energy and then you're consuming it. You may not eat it. You can. You can absolutely choose to eat it. You can put it in a piece of bread and eat the bread. In Thelema, that's the whole point of like cakes of light. You can put it into a chalice and drink the water, or you can just pull it directly down into your aura. Like invoke all these energies around you and then see it all collapse in you and fill you up with light. Either way, you are consuming divine sustenance. So you see what I mean by this is the initiation ritual. First you die, which is baptism, and then you start consuming divine sustenance, which is communion, which is the ritual work, however you want to look at it. And it's that communion, it's that ritual work that carries out the purification process, that turns you, that you become that glass of water held under the faucet, and that energy that you're taking in, whether it's in the form of communion or whether it's in the form of doing your ritual work, that is the water from the faucet, from the source, pouring into you and will gradually flush all of your impurities out. And honestly, that's what leads to the dissolution of self. Like what happens eventually is that you get flushed out on such a deep level that even for a short period of time, even what we think of ego gets flushed out. Now, it doesn't stay gone forever. This is what I've always said when I say, this is what I've always been talking about when I say that ego is like hair or fingernails or toenails. It grows back, that you can't kill ego. You're not supposed to kill ego. You hear people all the time now talking about ego death, kill your ego. You're not supposed to kill your ego. What you're supposed to do is realize that your ego is not permanent. It is temporary. It is an illusion. This I, this sense of individuality that is separate from the source. It is not a eternal thing. It will grow back. This is why I think of it like dissolution of self is almost like hitting a reset button, like restarting yourself. The old, like it dissipates, but then it's going to grow back, just like fingernails or toenails, but it's going to grow back in a more purified, refined state. Doesn't mean it's going to be perfect, not by any stretch or means of the imagination. What it means is it's going to come back in a form that is going to be more conducive to you accomplishing your will in this world. Like you're going to see through a lot of your own garbage, a lot of your own, internal crap. And when you see through it, what happens is it eventually starts fading away. It's a gradual process, but that's what I mean. So basically, when you're looking at the first two of three pictures in this alchemical metaphor, you are looking at the initiation process. You are looking at death, and you're looking at rebirth. That's all this is. See what I mean? This is the simplest aspect of it. Yeah, you can get into all this stuff about the laboratory equipment and, solar bodies and lunar bodies and all of this kind of stuff. And that would be the equivalent of like us starting to tell the average person on the street about hexagram rituals and pentagram rituals. And they're going to be like, what the hell are you talking about? I don't understand this. And a lot of times the people who are trying to describe it to them don't understand. Like up until really recently, most people who were doing magic didn't realize it was anything beyond like how to manifest stuff. They didn't realize that magic was a path and that there were mile markers along this path that they were supposed to be accomplishing, and that there was an end goal, like completion of the great work. And what I mean by mile markers, are things like the dissolution of self and attaining the knowledge and conversation of the HG. All these things are like mile markers that show where you are on this path. Most people didn't know that. You would hear people talking about attaining the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. You would hear them throwing it around because they read it in a book somewhere, but they didn't know what it meant. For the most part, most people just thought magic up until very recently was either a way to worship something else. They traded Christianity for worshiping some god and goddess, or they thought it was a way to, change themselves, change the world around them, whatever. You never really saw people talking about it in this way up until, think about how fast magic has been progressing even since I got out. I got out in 2011. But before I went to prison, like when I was a teenager, you didn't walk into bookstores and find books on magic the way you do now. There were very, very few books on magic, and most bookstores didn't even carry it because it was such a small niche genre that they weren't going to sell enough of them to make it worth their while to keep them in the store. Now you walk into any bookstore in the world, any Barnes and Noble in any little town anywhere in the U.S., and you're going to find like, I don't remember what they call it, but like a new age section or a magic section or whatever it is. So it was like, in the time that I got locked up, magic became much, much more accessible in just that people having access to it, things like that, like books. Well, the same thing is kind of happening now with understanding like what the point and purpose of all of this is, that it's not just about trading one religion for another. Self-improvement section. Wild Bill says the self-improvement section. That's what it's called. Couldn't think of it. Okay, so those are the first two pictures in the alchemical process. Third picture. Yeah, Cypher says the witchcraft movement has really popularized a lot of our lingo. So the third picture Jeffrey K says it was called the New Age section in the 1980s. So I'm kind of dating myself there because I remember very well when people used to call it the New Age section, and you would find anything to do with magic in any way lumped into the New Age section. But anyway, third step of the process. First one, Nigredo. Second, Albedo, death and rebirth. Third, Nigredo and Albedo. The third is Rubedo, the reddening stage. What does this represent? This represents the union of opposites. This represents what happens, like when you're going through the Albedo stage, that's when you're going to experience things like attaining knowledge and conversation of the HCA, dissolution of self or crossing the abyss, all of that kind of stuff. That's here. So most people think of that as like the end of the path, but it's not. We have a whole nother picture here. We have a whole nother step, a whole nother stage of this. So what would be the next stage? Well, think of it as like in the Zen ox herding pictures. In the Zen ox herding pictures, you know, you go through this whole, it tells this story of this man who goes through this whole stage of first, he is just wandering around in the world. And the first step is he sees that there are feet print, ox feet print, hoof prints. And then he starts following the hoof prints. And eventually in the distance, he catches a sight of the ox. And then eventually later, he's able to sneak up on the ox. And then later down the road, he's able to actually start riding the ox. And then later on after that, there is no more him and there is no more ox. What does that mean? That's the part what Gannicus is talking about right now, integration with your higher self. When he reaches the part where there is no man, there is no ox, that's integration with the higher self. But that's not the end of the path. The end of the path keeps going. The very last stage of the Zen ox herding photos is man returns to the world with helping hands. Same way in the hero's journey, you know, talking about Joseph Campbell. If you're familiar with Joseph Campbell in the hero's journey, the hero goes through this whole process. He gets the call to adventure. He leaves home. He goes on this big adventure and experiences all this stuff. The very last stage of the hero's journey is he returns to the world. Well, he does return to the world. You know, he returns to the exact same world that he came from in a way. This is why in Zen they say, before enlightenment, I chopped wood and carried water. After enlightenment, I chopped wood and carried water. That doesn't mean that no change has taken place. It has. He's went on this whole realm of adventures. He's been radically changed. He is not the same person internally anymore. Other people may not know that. They may see him and think, oh, it's the same old guy, but internally he is not the same person. But he comes right back to the world and does the same thing he was doing before, which is, I mean, chopping wood and carrying water is a metaphor for life. Like I'm doing, you don't have to chop wood and carry water. Maybe you're working for the electric company. Maybe you're writing books. Maybe you're a movie star. Maybe you're a mother, a stay-at-home mom. That's chopping wood and carrying water. It's just a metaphor for doing the things in life that you have to do to progress through life. But one of the things that we talked about in Magnum Opus was about how when you reach this part of the process, your practice is no longer going to look like what it used to look like. So this is a bringing together of two things. This represents the union of opposites. What does that mean? The union of opposites. What does that actually look like? Like that's one of those things that people throw it around. They say it and they're like, oh yes, very deep thing. I understand this or whatever. Well, what does it actually look like? What's it actually imply when the opposites have been united? Well, And what does that imply, and what does that say about why your practice will not look the same as it did previously? So opposites can mean a bunch of different things, but in this case, we're going to say your spiritual practice and your worldly life. These are opposites. Like your interaction with the higher realms, with the heavenly realms, and your normal daily life of chopping wood and carrying water, or taking care of the kids, or fixing people's hot water heaters, or writing books, or whatever the hell it is you do. Those are two separate things. During this stage, when you have the union of opposites, that's no longer true. There is no more heaven and earth. They have been united. You now know, not believe, not have faith. You know, you experience from a first-hand perspective that this is heaven. Earth is heaven. This is it. This is hell and this is heaven. This is both. There is no more spirit and earth. They are one thing. They have been united. Just like your spiritual practice and your earthly life have now been united. They will not be, this is why the form of them will change. You know, like when we're doing magic, when we're in this phase of the work, when we're here, there's doing magic and there's not doing magic. Doing magic is when we're closed up in our temple space and we're doing all of these rituals. Not doing magic is when we close our temple space down and we go out into the world and do whatever we got to do in the world. Go to Walmart, go jogging, go lift some weights, whatever it is you're doing. When you reach the final stage, the Rubedo stage, there is no longer any difference between your spiritual work and your earthly work. There's no more like, this is the time when I do ritual and this is the time when I do life. They become one thing. They become married. When that happens, you will not need to do the work in the same way that you used to do the work. Like, what does it mean, for example, when I'm trying to think of ways to make this more concrete, less abstract. What does it mean when I say that your life becomes your spiritual work? Well, think about it in magnum opus. When we were working our way through the elements in the very beginning of the work, we work our way through earth, we work our way through air, we work our way through water, we work our way through fire. And for each of these things, these elements that we work our way through, we also work on an aspect of ourselves. Like in earth, we say, take up an exercise routine, start eating healthier, maybe stop smoking, start spending more time in nature. A lot of times in the beginning, people are like, what does this have to do with magic? What does going for a walk in the woods or going for a walk along the beach or doing push-ups have to do with magic? That's not what I thought magic was. Well, that's because they're still thinking of magic and life as two different things. You realize at this part of the process, at the Rubedo stage, that doing those things is spiritual practice. Like when you are working on your body, you are working on the element of earth within yourself. When you work on your mind, you are working on the element of air within yourself. When you're working on reaching greater states of emotional maturity and psychic awareness, you are working on the water within yourself. See, all of these things that we're doing may not look like magic on the surface, but that's the thing about the final stage of the process is it might not look like you're doing magic anymore to the rest of the world, but you're still doing the great work. You are still refining, purifying, and strengthening all the different parts of yourself. So when I talk about like different levels that this exists on, you know, like this simple level, how this basically represents initiation, and then the more complicated level, like how you can bring in like, you know, all the internal workings and the visualizations and the breathing, or you could bring in like the alchemical lab equipment, all that, or we're talking about how magic uses all these rituals, what have you, all of that. My brain went blank. Where was I going with that? Oh, so that's one level, that's one stage of it, right? And when I'm describing it this way, it's a one-time thing. Like, for example, the Nigredo phase, the Nigredo phase, that death of the old, that would represent the death of your life before you started this journey. Like the person you were before you took your first steps on this path. The person you were before you knew that there was more to the world and more to the universe than just physical reality. Before you realized that you could operate and interact with all of these different, more subtle levels of reality through various means and shape different things and cause different things to happen and all kinds of stuff. The person who only knew, you know, the kind of person who sits around still and they're like, you know, I wonder if God is real. I wonder if there's really any angels. I wonder if religion is just bullshit or if there's something to it. You know, all of like that, like I wonder if there's life after death. That person has died. That's the death of that person. And the next step of the process is when you actually start living a new leg of this journey, like doing this stuff, interacting with the universe and the world in ways that most people don't even know are possible. You know, some people walk through life and they have this vague idea, like there's got to be something more to this. Like there's got to be some kind of meaning or something, but they don't know where it is. They haven't taken the first step on that process yet. That person dies, and then the new person is born, the person who goes on this adventure. So it looks like it's a one-time thing, right? Like a life-changing occurrence. But on an even different level, it happens over and over and over. You will die over and over and over. I'll give you an example in my own life. I'll give you 3 big, blatantly obvious examples in my own life. Some of you have been with me through all of these. What I'm going to describe to you are multiple deaths that I experienced. And whenever I say this, those of you who've been with me like since I got out are going to be like, oh yeah, I remember that. So when I first got out of prison, I didn't talk about magic ever, period, nowhere, in any kind of way. Number one, I still thought people would see it if I were to talk about it the way they did before I went to prison as something evil. If they took it seriously at all, most people I knew would not take it seriously. Most people would think it was complete trash. You know, here you've got this grown man talking about magic. I viewed it as, on one hand, something so serious that people tried to murder me for it, and I didn't want to take that chance again. I didn't talk about magic for years after I was out. A whole different story, but years went by and I did not talk about magic, period, ever. But I did speaking engagements. I spoke at law schools. I spoke in criminal justice classes. I spoke at like prison reform groups. I used to do talk shows. Went on a worldwide press junket whenever I was a producer on West of Memphis, the documentary. all I talked about was my experiences in the justice system, what had been done to me, what I'd went through, what I'd survived, but I'd never brought magic up at all. It was all about, bringing awareness to the fact that they say, for example, it's now estimated that 1 out of every 10 people that are executed are innocent. 1 out of every 10 people in the United States. Some countries are a lot worse. But it's estimated now that 1 out of every 10 people who are executed in the United States are innocent. So that's the kind of stuff I used to talk about and try to bring attention to. That was my job. I was prison guy. When people saw me, they thought of one thing. They thought of, oh, that's the guy who used to be on death row. That's the guy that was in those documentaries. That's the guy who talks about, how corrupt the justice system is, blah, blah, blah. They didn't equate me with magic at all. I didn't talk about magic at all. That was one incarnation that I went through. And then one day, someone asked me to do an interview about magic, and I did. And after the interview, it was a woman who owned a publishing company. She said, would you be interested in publishing a book with our publishing company on magic? And I said, yeah. And I wrote High Magic, wrote my very first book on magic. And from that point on, I used to get requests all the time, just ad nauseum, to be on podcasts about magic. Everybody and their mother has a podcast these days. And, I did interviews nonstop about magic. I started doing retreats on magic. I did classes on magic. I started doing my very first classes on magic in the back room of a tattoo shop in New York, the corner of Broadway and Canal. And my life completely and absolutely changed. I went from prison guy, and prison guy died. And then I went to being magic guy. And then eventually, when I reached the stage, that final stage of integration, I wasn't magic guy anymore. I mean, we still talk about it on here, but one of the things that I'm trying to do on here now is make people understand, share my own experiences with people and try to help them through their processes and understanding that magic is about way more than just ritual work. Magic is about doing push-ups. Magic is about filing taxes. Magic is about reading history books. Magic is about going for walks on nature. Magic is there is no difference. Yeah, Azel says, now you're karate guy. Exactly. That was another death. That's what I mean. This will happen more than, if you're very lucky and you don't stop, you will die several times in your life. And these are just the big ones that y'all have seen. These are just the transitions that y'all have stuck with me and seen me go with. There are other ones, like much more deeply, deeply personal ones that most people in the world don't even know about, just really intensely personal things, people I've been that have died. So there's levels and layers to this. You can look at it as this one-time thing on one level, because once you know that there is more to the universe than just the physical level of reality, you will never go back to what you were before. That's a one-time thing. You can never go back to not knowing that there's nothing but the physical universe and being completely ignorant of everything, every other level and layer of existence. So that is a one-time thing. But at the same time, you can die multiple times, just like y'all have seen me die multiple times. LJ says, how did you recognize this in the beginning? You'll have to be more specific. Like, how did I recognize what? What do you mean? But I wanted to show you one more picture. I like this one just because it kind of goes, how did I recognize the first death? Whenever I saw that, I mean, it wasn't a all at one time thing. Like, for example, after I put out High Magic, I would still have people contact me and say, you know, we do a show about people who've been wrongfully imprisoned. Would you be interested in doing this? And more and more and more, I was just like, no, I'm really not. And when I would look back on it, I was like, you're wanting me to talk about somebody that I'm not even that person anymore. So it's not like it was an overnight thing, like I just got up one day, although there were aspects of it that were instantaneous. Like the second that I finished writing High Magic, I knew to the core of my soul, I have done a huge part of what I came to this world to do. And I felt the same thing to a lesser extent, even whenever I passed my black belt test in karate. You have this feeling of, okay, I just poured a big chunk of my soul into something. But then you'll see also, last picture. Here, anytime you see these things, like this represents all three of the stages from those other, all the three other photos, the three other illustrations. This is all three of them combined into one. You see the white bird, you see the black bird, you see the red bird. Those represent all three stages of this work in one illustration. So this gives you an idea of like one of the lower levels of what this stuff means. It means dying, it means being reborn, and then it means integrating all of this stuff together to become even another new person. One thing I want to talk about real quick before we go, we're already at an hour. We are going to, this finally came out. I've been waiting on this book to come out for a while. I pre-ordered this like at least a month ago, maybe 2 months ago. It's called Etheric Magic or Etheric Magic by Ike Baker. A complete system of elemental, celestial, and alchemical magic. I want to read the back of it to you real quick. This is something that we're going to go into. Jeffrey says my copy just arrived. We're going to go into this in the future. This is very, very important. You know, like I said, all these rituals are just like training wheels. All the alchemical lab equipment is just like training wheels, that the magic is in here. It's you, and it's the energy that you work with. The back of it says, the ether, the energetic realm at the heart of esoteric traditions and vital to nearly every type of magic, has long been veiled in obscure language and mystery. Now, Baker demystifies the ether and teaches you how to use it in your practice. Step by step, Baker walks you through the history, theory, and practice of etheric magic, leaving no question or topic unexplored. This comprehensive book presents not only historical evidence of this energy, but also 50 practical exercises, ritual, breathwork, visualization, and more that teach you how to sense it and direct it towards magical goals. Uniting Western ceremonial traditions with Eastern energy healing practices, etheric magic helps you achieve material, spiritual, mental, and physical transformation in ways previously unimagined. So basically what this book is about, like if all those things are training wheels, really what it all comes down to is being able to perceive and manipulate the subtle energy that we are surrounded by and interpenetrated by. That's what all of magic comes down to. Everything else is just window dressing. For a lot, I think this book provides, it bridges a gap that's been in magic. You know, most people think the magic is in the stuff. You know, like the book of Abramelin the Mage. They think somehow that book has something in it that you don't find in any other aspect of magic. And that's something else I want to talk about too. We're going to talk about the book of Abramelin the Mage soon. But what it all comes down to, no matter what you're doing, whether you're doing alchemy, whether you're doing the Book of Abramelin the Mage, whether you're working your way through the Golden Dawn rituals, whether you're doing chaos magic, whatever it is, it's all the same thing. The window dressing might look a little different, but all of it are just training wheels that bring you up to being able to perceive, shape, and manipulate the subtle energies of reality. So I got that specifically because I wanted to read it to y'all. But another thing, I told y'all I'm getting ready to do, Gannicus is coming, Mike Randall is coming, Lori is going to do it now. I'm doing this Shaolin Warrior Monk retreat on Labor Day weekend. Starts on Friday afternoon, goes all the way to Monday afternoon, and it's led by a Shaolin monk who defected from China. He was put in the Shaolin monastery when he was 5 years old, grew up learning Shaolin Kung Fu, energy work techniques. He's doing a retreat where he's teaching Qigong, Tai Chi, and Kung Fu. And it's going to be Memorial Day weekend here in the Hudson Valley. And some of the Magnum Opus folks are going. Like I said, Gannicus is going to be there. Mike Randall is going to be there. Tammy's going to be there. Lori's going to be there. But I'm talking to Ike Baker, the guy who wrote this book, and he wants to come also. He has to see if his schedule is going to permit it because he's doing another retreat somewhere else. But hopefully, fingers crossed, he will be there too. All right, we're over an hour now, so I'm going to shut up. Hope y'all feel like you got something out of this, that it wasn't just me going crazy for an hour. But again, I want to end the way I started, just by thanking y'all for being in my life. Thank you, Gannicus. Thank you for saying that, Violet. Thank you, Cypher, Gail, Tanya. I appreciate you guys very much. Oh, Real to Real, Jose Raziel. Thank y'all very, very much. Thank you, Max. I just want to say I appreciate y'all being in my life. I appreciate your support. And you add as much to my life as I hopefully add to yours. I get something out of your presence in my life, just like hopefully y'all do in mine. All right, we will pick up where we left off in a couple of days, and I'll talk to y'all soon. Have a good night.